Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Environment Committee. Today's meeting will be a discussion on green spaces for London, and we encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtags GreenSpace and AssemblyEnv. We have a few short items of formal business to go through, first of all. And please can you make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions during the morning. Do we have any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Arnold, for whom Assemblymember Shah is substituting, and Assemblymember Gavril.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the list of offices on the report and ask if there are any additional interests to declare?
Noted. None.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the membership and chairing arrangements for the committee as set out at item 3?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the terms of reference to the committee as set out in item 4?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note the standing delegation to me as chair, which was agreed at the London Assembly annual meeting on the 2nd of May 2019?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to agree the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 28th of February 2019 as a correct record?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding action from previous meetings and the additional correspondence?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the action taken by me as chair in consultation with party group leads to agree an output from the 6th of December 2018 meeting on cold damp homes?
Noted.
That's it. That now brings us to today's main item for discussion. Can I ask the committee to note to note the Mayor's response to the committee's outputs on embodied carbon and cold damp homes. And thank you very much. That now brings us to today's main item for discussion on green spaces in London. And before I welcome our guests, please can I ask the committee to agree the scope and terms of reference of the investigation as attached at Appendix 1 of the report?
Agreed.
So, can I welcome today's guests? We have Peter Massini, who is the Principal Policy and Programme Manager for Green Infrastructure at the GLA. We have Helen Monger, who is the Director of London Parks and Gardens Trust. We have Tony Leach, who is the Chief Executive of Parks for London. We have Dave Morris, who is Chair of the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces, and we have Chris Whyte, who is the Operational Director, Environmental Services in the London Borough of Brent, Green Spaces Lead, and the London Environment Directors of the London Environment Directors Network. Thank you to all of you. You are all very welcome this morning. So we now move on to our questions, and I just want to open by asking each of you to set out how do green spaces benefit local residents' quality of life? So Peter, would you like to start and we'll move round?
So I guess in London, green spaces are quite a significant feature of London. It's always been a green city and it's something which is a feature of London. And those green spaces have been planned and designed and managed for a number of different purposes over the years. The original green spaces, places like Victoria Park, were created to provide places for the urban poor to actually go and relax and get fresh air. And that's been a sort of common theme for parks and green spaces for many years. Post-war, it's more focused on things like formal sport and recreation. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, there was more of an ecological movement to allow people to encourage people access to nature. So they provide a wide range of benefits directly to people, but also other environmental services. So increasingly now parks and green spaces are being managed to address issues like climate change adaptation, so storing floodwater. They can be designed to provide off-road transport routes, cycle routes and walking routes so people can avoid the most polluted areas. So they provide this very wide range of services, and I think something that we're trying to do as part of the work at the GLA is to be clear about the much wider range of services they provide than perhaps people acknowledge or understand.
Thank you. Helen, so yes, for you, sort of how do our green spaces benefit local residents' quality of life?
So, I agree with everything that Peter has said. What I'd add is that there is also a lot of stuff to do with social cohesion and community work. So one of the things we do is we run a big event called Open Garden Squares Weekend, which actually celebrates the spaces that aren't public parks, but community allotments, roofs, terraces, where people get together and they get to meet their neighbours. And there are very few places now in London where that is possible in the grand scheme of things. So it's a good way of neighbours getting together.
Thank you. Tony?
There are many benefits, and I think we'll cover a lot of them as we go round. But to me, one of the major factors concerning parks and green spaces is that they're free of charge. So they are society's truly democratic spaces. In fact, I would say the remaining democratic spaces that we have. So they are potentially usable by anyone from anywhere, no matter their age or background. The sad thing is they aren't necessarily always. And even if people don't actually physically go into them, many people benefit from them by walking past them or overlooking them. And that too is known to be of benefit to people as well psychologically. And I think more recently, sort of picking up on the sort of the journey of the relevance of parks and green spaces to society today has come full circle from when they were first initiated and laid out and provided by our forefathers, was the whole issue around public health. And there are so many issues around that parks and green spaces provide benefits for people's health.
Thank you. Dave?
Yes, well, funnily enough, I agree with everything that's been said as well.
Very
hopefully that will carry on throughout the whole session. But yeah, so there, on behalf of the community, if you like, and the Friends Groups movement, which I'm here to represent, they are unique spaces for local communities. They are essential infrastructure in our local communities. They're free, multi-purpose, flexible, attractive, open to all, 24/7, and as Helen said, they're particularly important for developing social interaction and social cohesion, and also community empowerment. People are often very disempowered in our modern world, and they're spaces that people can come together, act collectively, organise activities, have a say about this essential public service, especially, of course, if people are organised in friends groups, they can be partners in the management of that space. So, absolutely essential, unique spaces.
Thank you. And Chris, sorry,
Okay,
you
so
come at the end. So.
I'll probably get the job of summarising what. So yes, I mean the key issues are that they improve physical and mental well-being. They reduce issues around social isolation. They support community cohesion, particularly in deprived areas. But more and more they're becoming a green space that can support climate change resilience. Carbon capture in an urban setting is very important. And the promotion of biodiversity, again, in that urban setting is a very important programme that's now starting to flourish. But for a local authority, they also support economic regeneration, and they provide work, training and volunteering opportunities, which again is very important.
Thank you. Oh yes,
Just
one more.
One more thing I ought to mention about the importance of a lot of their spaces in terms of heritage and culture. So a lot of parks actually are fundamental to placemaking in certain locations because they have this huge sort of heritage and cultural value.
You've covered off all the things that I had prompts for, which is which shows what a solid briefing I have. So, do you want to?
I just wanted, because Chris was talking about the contribution in terms of climate change mitigation and the support for biodiversity. I was at a meeting last night where people were saying that there were 7 varieties of bat in their local park, and there is a Friends of group who are associated with that park. But I just wondered if you could say a bit more about air quality mitigation as well, because I think it's not just climate, is it? It's very much around air quality, and I think for us in London, the fact that we have so much green space must contribute to this with our toxic air problem.
Absolutely right. So yes, it's not as narrow, obviously, as the climate change issue. It does extend into other environmental concerns, particularly air quality. And, you know, our green open spaces, our foliage and shrubs and trees all contribute to mitigating the impacts around that. And, you know, those agendas are starting to be taken now very seriously by all local authorities across London, and the group that I represent, LEDNet, is starting to promote, you know, new ideas and new ways of working around that whole agenda. But one of the things that we're very keen to make happen is to see parks as very much the starting point, the nucleus of that approach, and extending our green spaces from parks and creating corridors and into the public realm, and starting to make a much greener extension of what we have already in place, well established within our parks as well, which we feel is important.
Thank you. Yes, the element of joining up is something that I've spoken about many times for Peter Massini about the green infrastructure, if you will. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, before I go on, Sean, you indicated you wanted to come in.
Sorry, just is this a point to bring up something about biodiversity? With this?
You could do, yes, if you wanted to.
I just want to ask a question. What are friends of groups doing? What are parks in general doing to support the biodiversity? Because you see lots of parks that are very well manicured, and they have magpies and crows and that chill out. What are people doing to support biodiversity?
Well, in terms of friends groups, a lot. I think it's one of the main things that friends groups are very keen on, and they're keen on a whole range of things, whether it's sports and recreation or social cohesion and activities and history and all kinds of stuff. But improving biodiversity is very important. I think Peter indicated in the last 20, 30 years that's become increasingly important. In my park, which is Lordship Rec in Tottenham, it was a traditional recreation ground, like you say, manicured lawns, if you like, for recreational purposes, and now it has a biodiversity status. The whole park has been transformed, basically led by the Friends Group, but supported by Haringey Council, into an extremely biodiverse range of areas and features. But maintaining its recreational value as well. So you can get a lot of things out of a green space if you sit down and work together and work out a long-term vision.
I think it's also about the patchwork of different environments that you can create. So not all green spaces are the same. And in the Royal Parks, they've been carefully managing in St James's Park the water in the ponds to clean the water through wild reed bedding in the centre of London, and they've now got lots of herons as well as the very carefully managed pelicans. So it's a balance, and I think we take for granted the fact that wildlife will survive, but if you look at the story of the sparrow, for instance, that was in London, it was a common thing, it was regarded almost as a pest, and now you see virtually no sparrows. So it's about offering a mixture. To look at one space and say this is the perfect space isn't right. A manicured park is right for some things, for amenity value, etc., for humans, but perhaps not so good for certain types of biodiversity. It depends on where you're going.
I understand. Thank you for your answer. I understand that. But I think what I'm asking, is anybody measuring how people are deliberately setting out to support biodiversity in London? Is anybody doing that? Are there friends of groups that's their main focus? Is there a local authority that they've made a decision to support that in one way?
Well, I can speak for the London Borough of Brent, where I'm based. One of the consequences of the funding pressures on local authorities, has been a review of the spend around parks and the parks maintenance, and we've been prompted to really address the spend in our park, look at different ways of managing and maintaining our parks, and moving away in certain instances from a very manicured landscape to something that's maintained in a much more relaxed way that allows grass in certain areas to grow much longer. So we've got different and varying habitats across previously well manicured park spaces, and that's starting to encourage that biodiversity. That's supported by a sowing program around wildflower seeds and the like as part of those new habitat areas. So very often, where there are funding pressures, it has promoted new ways of working.
Thank you. David.
Just a quick one. I've heard there's certain types of trees that are actually especially good at improving air quality, mopping up carbon dioxide, mopping up pollutants as well. Thinking of the London plane tree and the willow tree is another one I heard. Have you got any thoughts on that? And is that true, or what are parks doing if it is to sort of like improve the number and quantity of those trees?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah.
Yes, different types of trees, but not just trees, all kinds of plants have different qualities of their ability to filtrate the air, and there's a lot of research that's gone on for years on that. And it's not just the species, it's also the way they are grown. So take, for example, beech could be grown as a hedge as well as a tree. And in terms of filtration next to roads, a hedge is often more effective. And it's a combination of all those different types of structures within the landscape, the microclimate that it creates, whether it channels and keeps pollution within a certain area or dissipates it. It can all be achieved by design and careful selection of different species. But yes, you're right, and it's using that science to the benefit of
Giggle. Say something about Giggle as well.
Just to add to that, we're now working with TfL and the University of Birmingham specifically to look at how you might improve green infrastructure to provide barriers to air quality. So it's that issue around thinking about how you might plant hedges along busy roads, green walls along school playgrounds to act as a physical barrier. I mean, you can construct hard physical barriers, but clearly a vegetated physical barrier is more attractive and can provide quite a significant reduction of air pollution close to the areas where air pollution is worse, which is busy main roads.
Okay, so I'll get us back looking at the quality of life aspects of parks. And I'll start again with Peter on this one, but everyone is welcome to chip in. How are the benefits of green space distributed across London and across different sections of London's population?
That's quite a complex
It is.
question.
It's a big one.
So there is some uneven distribution of those benefits, and that's partly a consequence of London's historic development. So central London's always been densely developed ever since the rebuilding of London since the Great Fire. So Tower Hamlets, parts of Newham, parts of Southwark, Hackney, southern parts of Hackney Easton have always been very densely developed with a limited amount of green space. Because it was only when the Victorians, recognised the importance of creating public green space that set-piece parks were created. And it wasn't really until post-war, after the Abercrombie plan for London, that the idea that the planning system should actually ensure you create a network of parks and green spaces. So if you think about post-war development in Barking and Dagenham, for example, extensive areas of green space, because that was part and parcel of the philosophy of creating homes fit for heroes with extensive areas of green space. In the 1960s, places like New Addington and Thamesmead were built as garden cities on the edge of London, and they still got extensive areas of green space. So it's not a sort of truism that every area with which is maybe a more deprived area is necessarily lacking in green space. Mm-hmm. It's true in places in central London and parts of London like areas of Hounslow where green space is limited by industrial development and proximity to Heathrow. But in other parts of London like Barking and Dagenham, New Addington, Thamesmead and many other areas which are still relatively deprived actually have lots of access to green space. So it's a very complex and mixed picture, mm-hmm. Partly a consequence of the historical development of London.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that, just in terms of particularly sort of benefits to, if you're thinking about people that with disparities in income, differences in gender, age, ethnicity, disability, just in terms of how the benefits are distributed amongst the population. Are there groups who are getting less access to parks than others?
I mean, I think that there's anecdotal evidence that for parks where there is less well-maintained areas and a sense of lack of security, women and particularly ethnic minorities opt not to go through those areas. I don't have evidence to prove it, but I know that I did a project only last month with a group of refugees in Barnet, and we introduced them to Kenwood, and they didn't even realise that it was something they could go to for free. We then took them into Russell Square. It was based on the history of Repton and his influence on London, and we taught them through a bit of garden history, and they had the opportunity, with thanks to the London Borough of Camden and the commissioners of Russell Square, to plant 3 rose bushes that we bought for them, and you've never seen so much excitement. And they, went away feeling absolutely chuffed, and they felt, that it was part of their history now, but they didn't feel that before we'd done the project. However, that's very resource intensive, and sustaining that for every refugee in London would be very difficult. But certainly talking to them, we discovered that they had never realised that they could have access to those areas without some kind of expense.
I don't know, Chris, Dave, I'll bring you in, but Chris, I just wonder from a local authority perspective, is that something, a kind of work that local authorities are trying to do to make sure that wider groups of people feel enabled?
It is all about accessibility, and one example would be the London Borough of Hounslow, who are undertaking a £1 million investment programme to link up 3 different parks, creating bridges over rivers, but also looking at the entrances to those parks, widening them, making them certainly more accessible, but also giving a sense of them being much safer as well. So I'd cite the London Borough of Hounslow being a very good example in that regard.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, I think that in the 80s and 90s, because of the cuts to public services, parks went into decline because they didn't have the resources, and they became unsafe areas and perceived as unsafe by communities, and the usage dropped dramatically. And when the kind of renaissance started in the 2000s with the growth of the Friends groups and some interest at government level to put more resources into green space, that was turned around. And I can say for my own park, again, I don't want to big up my own park, but it's something I'm very knowledgeable about, obviously. Our park was virtually unused. It's 26 hectares in the centre of urban Tottenham, next to Broadwater Farm, and hardly anybody went in there. And thanks to a long-term vision, partnership working with the council, with the Friends in the council, and lottery funding, so we had an £8 million regeneration of our park. We've trebled the usage of the park, and the diversity of people using it, and the diversity of activities. And people stay longer as well, because we have a building in the park which we run. Actually, it's a community building with a cafe. You have to have the facilities and you have to have the management to make parks attractive. You can't just have an abandoned green space and expect people to go in there. They need facilities, they need toilets, they need staffing, and they need the range of features that people would expect.
Mm-hmm. And you said there's a much, since the parks, your friends group got involved, there's a wider range, and you had all this investment, there's a wider range of activities. Can you just slightly scope out just give us flavour of what sort of activities are going on? One of our strategies as the Friends group was to encourage the development of autonomous user groups. So we developed, a wildlife group, a sports and activities consortium, walking group, gardening group, and a whole range of different groups, arts collective to organise activities, a women's group. So as well as the Friends group, we have a range of groups that organise activities and engage different sections of the community. So in terms of activities, it's absolutely dramatic, the change in the use of the park from what it was traditionally 15, 20 years ago and longer.
as a kind of traditional recreation ground. But I do say, when it was created, these traditional recreation grounds used to be packed out, absolutely packed out at weekends. So there's still a great deal of potential to attract more people into parks with more activities. But you have to have facilities. Don't forget, in Haringey, I think up to the 80s, we had 300 park staff, and now we've got, I think it's 29. So, if you're going to attract people into parks, you have to have the staff on the ground, you have to have the resources, you have to have the facilities, and the will. And and the community involvement. I think that as a whole package, that's what our parks need.
You listed a whole list of different kinds of these autonomous groups, covering a whole range of different people. Are you in contact? Are you working with your local clinical commissioning group, with the sort of health groups, in terms of addressing mental health and well-being benefits that you could be getting from the park?
Not specifically in our park, but we're aware of the health agenda, if you like. There is a walking group that is funded. Well, it used to be the Public Health funded it. I think it's now from the Health and Wellbeing Board fund.
Yeah.
The training of the walk leaders. No, I think that there should be more resources coming from the health sector to support parks on the ground, whether it's features like outdoor gyms, which we have, which I think every park should have outdoor gym. They're really popular, or I don't know, other forms of financial support, because parks can't provide those facilities without financial support.
Peter?
Just be surprised how expensive outdoor gyms are. I mean, our one cost £120,000 for about 15 pieces of kit.
So, just in terms of the link to public health, there's a major initiative about to be launched, which is embargo, so I can't say much about it right now, but next week I think it's going to be announced, which will look at how you might recommission parks as public health assets. So I think there's quite a big, significant movement towards that, and it's got a lot of funding from central government and National Trust and Heritage Lottery Fund to explore that very issue, how you recommission parks as public health assets. And that's about retraining staff to engage more in a public health agenda as well as managing parks. And Public Health England are about to review their guidance on access to green space and the role of parks in promoting public health. So that's something that's quite a significant sort of sea change in, and it goes back to the original intention of public parks to provide public health assets, so we must come full circle in that respect.
Yeah, I know certainly in Islington that there's a lot of work being done around mental health and wellbeing and gardening groups in sort of green spaces. Tony, you look like you were wanting to...
Well, I'm conscious that it kind of comes up a bit later, but so lots of these things intermingle. But last week we launched a Health Parks Toolkit, which I'll give you details of, which is an audit tool that anybody can use. There's a free section of it, so it's to empower community groups to go out and do an audit of their green space, measuring the potential for improvements to make them healthier, and the outcomes are very much linked to health outcomes of nice. So that's really useful. And it's both a bottom-up and a top-down thing, which you'll come on to later, I think. But I just wanted to go backwards slightly, so that what has changed dramatically in terms of access to spaces is that the technology has moved on, and the mapping of access and of biodiversity is now mapped, and Peter might want to say a bit more about this in a minute, but there's an organisation called Green Space Information for Greater London. I will never remember the full proper name, but they going back to the biodiversity, volunteers go out and record loads of different types of plants and animals, and that's all recorded. And that's all mapped, and it's now being combined with a lot of other data, which I'll let Peter explain more about, which together with knowing about where the need is in terms of, say, health and well-being and the opportunity, you can do much more targeted interventions. And I think we all know that there is going to be no new money to invest substantial amounts of money in parks.
Not
But-
at least for a week.
You
have to shout louder.
But it will help people to use their resources much more intelligently, and maybe be a point for Peter just to briefly explain the map.
Do that now?
Yeah, why not? Yes.
So the Mayor, the GLA, published we've called it a green infrastructure focus map, and essentially it's a set of data sets or data layers which identifies all the open space in London, the green cover, the canopy cover, and then matches that with a range of other issues, so flood management, demographic information, health information, information about where air quality is worse. And it's a decision support tool, so looking at where your parks are, where the greatest need is in terms of addressing particular issues, and helping you to target where you might want to invest in improving a park or investing in other green infrastructure. So it's effectively a decision support tool that boroughs can download. They can download the data, and they can augment it with their own data or data from the London Data Store, because there's a huge amount of data out there now that's free to use via the London Data Store, that people are beginning to download, analyse and help to make informed decisions to make best use of the available resources and address particular needs.
Just to say that's slightly different from data available to the general public on where their nearest green spaces are, etc., and getting them involved, say, in planning decisions. And so my organisation has been creating, through 25 years of volunteer effort, a catalogue of the history of as many green spaces as we can throughout London, and we make that publicly accessible online as London Gardens Online. And there are other tools that CPRE are beginning to develop to do with trying to bring the sort of all the friends groups data into one portfolio, so that the general public can go, oh, I fancy going to a park today, where's my nearest park, what does it offer, how do I get there? And that's
its
sort of
history.
thing. Yeah,
and
exactly.
Yeah. Chris, you've been...
Just to say, yes, I think the whole social prescribing concept, where people being referred to make use of parks and open spaces for health and well-being benefits, is certainly provides a great opportunity. I think the link between GPs and parks providers, the people responsible for the stewardship and maintenance of parks, can be established very, very easily, but I think the challenge and the work that needs to be done is around broadening those linkages so that there's a more uniform offer across the whole of London around those particular issues. I think that's the challenge, that's the work that remains.
Yeah, thank you. Just before I bring in Leonie and then Sean, who's also indicated, I just wanted to pick up with Peter. I know in the Park Life report that the Assembly did, this committee did when Leonie was chair back in 2017, it was one of the first reports the committee did in this term. We asked the Mayor to appoint a Green Infrastructure Commissioner, and I just noted that that a Green Infrastructure Commission has just started just very recently and is due to report back next year. Can you just let us know, are they going to, is part of their brief looking at the sort of the distribution of green space and access and these sort of more social elements
so
of access?
It's a Green Spaces Commission, and we brought together a number of experts in the field to particularly look at how park services can be transformed. It sort of picks up on the point that Chris made about how local authorities reconfigure their services. So you've got better relationships between the public health team and parks teams. A lot of the data and information around parks is out there in various forms, and boroughs have huge amounts of data about their parks. So the Commission's more looking at the structure and function of the park service rather than looking into details about around data issues. And the idea is to work with a number of local authorities and this big initiative, which is going to be announced next week, which I can't talk about. It's not our initiative, it's the national initiative. To see how park services can be integrated into a local authority's sort of statutory functions. So I think one of the issues that park services have suffered from is that they've been slightly isolated within a local authority because they're not a statutory service and because they're not they're seen as a nice to have. where local authorities focus their attention around statutory duties like child protection, public health, housing, park services need to understand how they relate to those statutory services. And there's lots of good work going on in boroughs. We brought the commission together to try and provide a sort of overarching framework to that and identify where there's best practice so boroughs can learn from each other.
Great, thank you. Lena, you wanted to come in.
Well, actually, that's teed up very nicely for the first area that I just wanted to explore, because there's a bit of an elephant emerging in the room, which is to do with the fact that in the past, parks and green spaces have been massively underfunded, and we've moved back into an area where there has been more funding, but not necessarily directly through the statutory services for the reasons that you've just been outlining, Peter. But it's come through things like, gambling, and has then come through the Heritage Lottery Fund. We've had exactly the same thing in my local. Actually, it's not a park; it's a common, and we have been talking a lot about parks and gardens, but let's make sure that we mention that there are some really big commons, which I do think we probably need to focus on their biodiversity. But we had a Heritage Lottery Fund grant for 97 hectares of Tooting Common. Now, that tells you also that it happened a lot later, and the Heritage Lottery Fund is making smaller grants, capital grants, for larger spaces. 8 million for 26 hectares is a lot better than 3 million for 97. And it was all on the heritage features as well. So I think one of the issues is about the money, and we haven't really touched on the fact that there are a lot of leisure opportunities, particularly in parks, some of which are now starting to be charged for. And I just wondered if you feel that local authorities should then hypothecate any money that comes in from, outsourcing all their tennis courts to someone that runs tennis courts and then gets money coming in from that. Should that come back into the parks? If they're charging for, people using cafes, if they've got franchised cafes, that sort of thing. Is that an area, is that an additional source of money? Or do you feel that all of those things should still be free? And I'm going to start with Tony first.
Okay. Well, the picture across... We do an audit for the last 3 into the third year, do an audit of London Borough Parks services. We look at a range of 10 different criteria with a view to encouraging them to improve their services. On the issue of, in a sense, fees and charges, be it from sports and recreation or from events, dare I say.
Events,
different boroughs, it's a political decision at the end of the day, borough by borough. And some boroughs have made the decision that they will hypothecate the money and it will go back into the park, or sometimes the park and the surrounding parklets and green infrastructure. So there's a variety of ways of dealing with it. Some boroughs don't know where their money goes, but I suspect it goes back to the corporate pot. And some make a distinct decision that it will go, or a proportion of it will go back to the corporate pot. That worries me a bit, because then the parks can become a bit of a cash cow for council services, and I think that's treading on dangerous water. So in terms of trying to develop and encourage good practice, we would encourage that income is brought back into the park and reinvested. Again, it's different in different parks because of the different sizes, what they can do, and the opportunities that they have. But there's another issue that's new, which is where fees and charges are being introduced for example, professional dog walkers, personal trainers and the like, who in many cases will come in, use a public park for free, run a business, make a living, nothing wrong with that, but nothing comes back to the park. And so what we've encouraged is we've looked across what different boroughs do, what the Royal Parks do, and we've developed a template for boroughs to follow and adopt to save them having to reinvent the wheel and to try and encourage a degree of consistency.
So you have some good practice that you've developed.
Yes.
Would that be something you could provide to us so that we could,
absolutely.
that might be one of our recommendations that comes out of this second looking at parks
Yeah.
and open spaces. And Dave, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this as well, and do you also think that local authorities should charge friends groups to run events? I'm guessing the answer might be
I'm not
no,
sure if that's the right question.
but I thought I'd ask.
So obviously funding, as you say, is the elephant in the room,
Yeah.
and basically we have an underfunding crisis nationally for parks and green spaces because of cuts to public services, huge cuts to all public services, but obviously the non-statutory services are suffering greatly, even though they're providing a range of statutory outcomes that all the other services need. So can I just take this opportunity to refer to the documents that I've circulated through to get them on the record. So this is the statement that the London Green Spaces Friends Groups Network, which I'm the chair of, put to the committee at the end of 2016. And there's a whole range of relevant information in there which I won't refer to. I would quote the mayor though on the front page. He said about funding for green spaces, as is Mr. Khan, I will continue to highlight that the adverse impact of local authority funding, underfunding of this, and lobby government to ensure local authorities are adequately resourced to deliver a full range of necessary and important local services. So, as a recognition from the Mayor of London that central government, in this issue of the funding of green space, central government is the cause and the solution to the problem of underfunding. And I'm also a representative on the national body Parks Action Group, which is liaising with government. It's national green space organisations and government departments working together to kind of address this underfunding crisis.
But, so in sum, you would say
And we're trying to put pressure on the government.
You think it should come in central support to local authorities rather than individual charges? That seems to be what you're saying.
Yes, because the public pay taxes and they
Sure.
expect public
No, I understand
services
the
to
argument.
flow from that in a fair way.
Yeah.
And
Can I just ask
there
Helen?
is a lot of resources available at central government. The government is committed to funding essential infrastructure, which they deem
No,
essential,
but-
such as HS2
But we have to
or
spend 60 billion
nuclear
on
warheads.
HS2.
But,
And in a minute, Tony will tell us how much we're going to spend on expanding Heathrow Airport with a third runway,
But I think-
which none of us support. But Dave,
But-
I just
but
want to move
can
on
I just-
to...
can I
No,
just say-
sorry, I just want to move
Oh,
on to Helen. And I just wondered whether there's a conflict also between the funding that goes to the larger flagship parks and the smaller parklets and gardens and obviously heaths and commons and all the rest of it.
Well, I think there
from
is...
your perspective,
I mean, I think there
is there a solution?
I agree with Dave. The solution is that actually you need
Central.
quite a lot of central funding because parks contribute to greater well-being good, as we've discussed already this morning. But going on to the thing about sort of individual charging, I mean, there are local authorities, as Tony said, where they then use, say, the tennis courts go to a particular group such as GLL, who are famous and for doing various things. They charge money, that becomes a barrier for people to get health through playing tennis. But not only that, they need to make a certain amount of money so it doesn't go back into the park. Or they decide that they're not going to make any money from it, so they don't bother to monitor. So then what happens is the tennis court gets degraded and then you get antisocial behaviour. So either way, I don't think that individual financing model works. Mm-hmm. I think also there is an over-reliance on commercialisation of parks through events. And a lot of big events are happening, and there was an example where in the West End, a very small park, Victoria Embankment Gardens, there was a proposal for the park to be shut for 9 months to put a cinema. Now, I would argue there's enough cinemas in the West End that you don't need another one that takes up a park. And then you go on to sort of what I call creeping memorialisation, and where everybody wants to put a physical memory of something. The one that I'm particularly involved with is Victoria Tower Gardens and the UK Holocaust Memorial. But either way, it's all about taking space and changing its use. And it's a sort of the park becomes a dumping ground for everything that nobody can think of anywhere else to put. And then but that detracts from the well-being. Yes, I think parks are quite contemplative places, but that particular example of Victoria Tower Gardens, you're going to have a national memorial with all the security that comes with that, juxtaposed against a playground. Now, who wants to get their kids to roll down a hill over a UK Holocaust memorial? Nobody. And there are other examples of that. Hampstead Heath, there's now a proposal for a memorial there. That's an area of wilderness, and that memorial, in my opinion, will then detract from the sense of wilderness. So there's a creeping sort of sense that parks can fulfil so many other functions without the need for money. And then just to come back to you about the sort of financing point again, there's also a misconception that parks look after themselves. Parks are costly business. It takes a lot, whether it's to manage for biodiversity, whether it's to manage for amenity value. And by relying on haphazard funding through fees doesn't really cut the mustard.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether you want to add anything to all of that, Chris, or whether we've got to
think
the I agree with everyone else stage.
Well, I do agree with others. You know, I think, you know, in terms of the borough that I represent, you know, fees and charges, you know, have been a long established element of the overall budget to manage our parks. Quite honestly, it's not new. It's not something that's been brought in recently to account for funding shortages, but it's an important means of sustaining the work that we do in our parks.
But the important point that you just made is that the fees and charges are there to help you fund the parks, and that was the issue that I was raising at the beginning, because and do you think that's where the money that comes in should go to? So, you know, football pitches all over Tooting Common annoys me because they are a biodiversity wilderness. It is a common, but, you know, they're not going to go away because the amount of money that comes in from those football pitches, you know, the council needs it. And so, and the argument then becomes about, can there be some free hours on the football pitches for, you know, teams of children? And the same with the tennis, you know, all-star tennis we have, runs all the tennis courts now across all of Wandsworth, everywhere. And, you know, can we have some free hours for small children to play tennis rather than you always have to pay £6 an hour? You know, but does it come back in?
It certainly comes back in. So our parks budget has got two very clear elements: an expenditure element and an income revenue element, and that's all part of the one package that helps us provide parks to our
does
local.
LEDNet have a sort of line for its membership? The London Environment Directors Network that you're part of, does it have a line to its members to say, please hypothecate the funds that comes in towards parks, commons, parklets?
That's the view, and you know, the balancing of you know, making our parks accessible but also affordable is, you know, is a very key consideration with my colleagues across London. That's for sure.
Okay, so that's one of the things. And I just wondered if I could turn to you, Peter, with a slightly different thing, but relates back to some of the things we were talking about earlier on. As you know, I've pressed you quite hard on the All London Green Grid guidance and when we might see the SPG, and I understand that is going to be after the examination in public of the London plan is completely finished. Is that in some way going to ensure through that SPG that the benefits of green spaces are distributed across the whole of London? I mean, bearing in mind that still lots of people are paving over their front gardens and probably, actually, it's become a thing that people are putting plastic grass in their back gardens because it's obviously too much trouble to look after grass, particularly if you have children. But I mean, you know, can you give us any kind of update on when the SPG might arrive?
Well, so first of all, yes, SPG is spatial planning guidance. So it's planning guidance, supplementary planning guidance to the London Plan policy. It can't actually be published until the new London Plan is actually formally published. That won't be until spring 2020. So SPGs can't be published before that date. In relation to the SPG, because it's a strategic planning guidance, it can't get into the detail about, you know, front gardens or individual householders putting plastic grass down. That's decisions by individual householders. What it does do is try to identify how the network as a whole can be planned, designed and managed better to provide those benefits citywide. Individual decisions are down to local authorities, local green space managers, National Trust or Royal Parks, but it's trying to set a framework to say, if you manage this in a more coherent, holistic way, you optimise those benefits. But the local benefits and the local need has to be a decision taken at a local level, because that's where it's best understood and where a local authority is able to identify and also identify the trade-offs, because I think one of the things we forget is that parks and green spaces, because they are public spaces, are contested spaces. Tooting Common, you've got a it's contested between those who want more biodiversity and those who want to play football. You can't have a biodiverse football pitch. You
it's
have
quite
to have
hard, I found that.
but you have to find ways in which you can accommodate both, and the green infrastructure approach is attempting to do that. And it goes back to the point I think Chris made, is thinking about the parks network as not this network of isolated, fenced-off spaces. How does that parks network encroach into the public realm? So how do you start thinking about healthy streets, green walking, cycling corridors that actually connect up and link those spaces, so the benefits which are provided by a set-piece park begin to be realised in other parts of the public realm. And we're heading in that direction, partly because we're reducing the amount of traffic in parts of London. The public realm is becoming, the public realm is largely streets. Streets are becoming more public realm as fewer people drive cars, more people walk, more people cycle, and that provides opportunities for that parkland environment to spread out into the streets. And I think Chris touched on that, so we've probably got some examples in Brent where that's happening. Can I just make one other point about
that brings me on to my last question,
charges
actually,
and
as well.
fees?
Yes.
So that's pretty complex, and there's lots, and all boroughs have to think of sort of blended finance models about core funding they bring in through revenue generation, through sports facilities or events. The one area that's currently untapped, and it's something which we're exploring through policy and through trying to influence government policy, is how parks and green spaces can be planned and managed to provide wider benefits. For example, flood management. So a good example is in Lewisham, where Lewisham Town Centre is one of the town centres in London which has had quite intensive development, quite dense development to meet housing needs, to meet all the other needs we have in London. Lewisham Town Centre used to flood regularly. That flooding has been abated by upstream interventions in a number of parks along the Quaggy and along the Ravensbourne. That was funded by Environment Agency money, some European funding, largely public funding, enabling the development of Lewisham Town Centre. One of the things we need to think about in the future is how you capture some of that land value from development to fund the management and maintenance of those upstream interventions. That's quite a complex thing to do, but capturing land value to pay for long-term management of parks is something that we need to think about as London grows and becomes more dense, and those parks become even more vital for people's health and well-being.
But can I pick up on that?
I think that's part of the overall work that the Environment Agency is doing around the concept of natural capital.
Exactly.
And trying to develop the whole concept and seeing how valuable nature is and how much we overlook it in terms of that sort of capital value.
Government are trying to think this through as well.
Yeah.
It is quite complex.
Yes. Sorry, Helen, you wanted to...
I was just going to pick up on that, though, that there is a temptation for local authorities through planning to rely on the private sector to deliver public realm, and the temptation, and therefore to maintain it, and the temptation there is then to go for the cheapest option. So SIL becomes public art rather than green space, and it becomes hard landscaping, and the quality goes down. And in effect, what you're creating is hostile environments within the public realm rather than green space. And a relatively good example of that is the Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea Development Opportunity Area, where there was supposed to be 8 hectares of green space, and in fact now there's a linear path rather than park, which is hard standing, where the private developers have put sort of barriers so that you can't get in, where half of it is actually a moat for the US Embassy, and so on and so forth.
This is not a temptation, this is government policy
Yeah.
that has restricted funding in the way that Dave was suggesting through a programme of austerity since 2010, announced by the then Chancellor as such. And everything in the public sector is to be funded through developers. So when a housing developer comes into an area, they will be funding the schools, the infrastructure, in some cases the doctors' surgeries, and absolutely everything else. This is not a temptation. This is not a temptation, this is government policy.
No, but the small element that goes to public
You can't. We
green
cannot.
space
We have to.
becomes-
We're operating in that context, and Tony, if you support that, then that's fine.
I'm simply saying what's
some-
new about it. Your governments did it.
Not.
Section 106. Constant.
Yes, but that was in addition to
Let's-
money coming in from other sources.
Liam,
Anyone would think that there was an election happening in this building in about 9 months' time. I just wanted to ask one final question, which is sort of speaks to the whole thing about green infrastructure and the sort of the joining of the different areas, and the benefits of having fewer smaller parks and fewer lots and lots of smaller green spaces versus having large areas. I mean, obviously I really enjoy living next to the 97 hectares of Tooting Common, but we also have the Fursdown Recreation Ground and a number of other smaller spaces. There are some areas that don't have those big areas, but they have. Do they have sufficient of the small, and do the small compensate for not having the big? Or are they better?
That's another complex question, because it depends on who you are and what you want to do or not do. I think turning it on its head, what we have in London are about over 3,000 parks and green spaces of a variety of sizes, and every single one of them is unique, and the communities around them are unique. So the answers to many of these questions are going to involve a diversity of solutions, and just also down to funding as well. It's not going to be one thing, but most boroughs the boroughs I'm talking to, they've been told their park service needs to be cost neutral by next year, and so they have to bring money in somehow. That's the challenge we have.
Okay.
Just to pick up on your issue about small spaces, so if you look at a map of access to green space in London, there are clearly parts of London, largely in central London, not exclusively, where there is a lack of access to traditional parks and open spaces of a certain size. Some of those areas, as I mentioned before, have always been densely developed. It's not possible to insert a new 3-hectare park into Tower Hamlets, and because it's already built. So the issue there is, how do you provide the benefits, or some of the benefits, of a traditional park in different ways? And that's about how you green new developments, how you make streets playable so there's less traffic and children can play in the streets. And the new London plan policy around urban greening and an urban greening factor is saying that all new development needs to contribute in some way to providing additional greening, not necessarily green space, but different forms of greening, to provide some of the benefits that you would otherwise get from a park.
Obviously, I'm very fond of the urban greening factor because I did my own rapporteurship on that.
And Leonie, you've taken us neatly into the next section of questioning, which is going to be led by Sean, on providing green space. And Sean, I know you had your hand up.
All right, brilliant.
Okay, perfect.
Morning all. Let me start by saying my first question will be, what are the main challenges in providing green space in London? Because of course London already exists. The idea of new green space is a massive challenge, so it's about the green space we have. But of course on the outskirts of London as well, there's lots of green space that's inaccessible. So what are the main challenges about, as you would see it, of providing green space in London?
Cost is the simplest. I mean, land costs, maintenance costs, capital costs for actually creating it, whether it's a living wall, a green roof, etc. But obviously there's an initial outlay that can be compensated. So if you have a green roof, then obviously that helps with insulation, it helps with flood mitigation, etc. So long term, the public gains, but initially it costs to create that sort of space, and that obviously becomes a barrier.
I think there's an issue also around the availability of skilled, experienced labour in parks and open spaces. I think the generally low wages that associated with that work doesn't lend itself to meet the costs of living in this area. So the pool of skilled, available labour to maintain our parks in the right ways, I think, is a particular challenge.
Just to pick up on a couple of issues. So I mentioned about it in already densely developed London. You need to think differently about how you provide that space. So it's not about, so you can't create a new 3-hectare park in the City of London. But you can provide alternative forms of some sort of public open space. So actually, a very recent development in the City of London is one of the new tower blocks, which are many of them being built. They've actually created a public open space at roof level, and it's free to use. So it's not a private roof garden; it's a public open space.
So how do members of the public who don't live in the block, they can access it as well?
It's a commercial block, so it's an office block, but at ground level there's a lift, goes straight to the top of the roof, and anyone can go up there. So it's now being used by people in their lunch break, to have their lunch, and it's providing a small, but obviously in the City of London you can't provide big spaces.
And that is a rare example.
It's rare, but it's
because there are lots of places where they have roof space, but it's only accessible to the residents.
Yeah, it's rare, but that's now changing because again, there's a recognition that that's the only way you can provide that public open space, and obviously you need to negotiate with the building owner. The other opportunities are around where you've got existing open space which is not public. So, and again, there's some really good examples. Perhaps the best example being Walthamstow Reservoirs, a huge area of open land in between Haringey and Waltham Forest, operational reservoirs, unavailable to the public for hundreds of years, partly through Heritage Lottery Fund money, but also partly through a lot of work between Walthamstow Council, Waltham Forest Council and Thames Water. Thames Water have now said, okay, that's now public accessible. Now it's completely open to the public now. It took a long time to negotiate with Thames Water because it's an operational reservoir. They've got lots and lots of restrictions on public use of that space. There's significant health and safety issues, and the site is now free public use.
Are there many sites like that across
Yeah,
London?
so another example is Beckenham Place Park. Beckenham Place Park in Lewisham. Again, it was technically available to the public, but no one used it because it wasn't formally public open space. The local authority have now taken ownership of that. It used to be a golf course, it's no longer a golf course, and they've got Heritage Lottery Fund money to make it publicly accessible. And another good example is Burgess Park. Burgess Park was a series of discrete spaces, not properly joined up, again with funding from Heritage Lottery Fund, from the GLA, and a lot of money from regeneration funding. That's now a continuous space and probably one of the most well-used spaces in South East London, and a huge success. So there are ways in which you can make existing space better used and more accessible. It's quite complex because you're stitching things together and you're bringing together lots of stakeholders, private landowners, developers, local authorities, community groups to come up with a solution. But it can be done. There's some fantastic examples where that's happened. Just finally about the green belts. The green belt, there's lots of private land in the green belt which isn't publicly accessible. There have been initiatives in the past like Thames Chase Community Forest where areas of land have been turned into public accessible woodland. We're hoping to fund a project with Enfield next year to do a similar exercise, taking areas of land which is currently farmland owned by Enfield Council and turning it into a woodland that's publicly accessible rather than farmland. But there are significant barriers. Private landowners in the Greenbelt, even with current policy about not developing the Greenbelt, if you're a private landowner and you own land on the edge of a city, you can sit on it for years and hope for the time when it will be developed. And clearly, if it's developed, it's worth a fortune. So there's a reluctance to release that land for public use. But again, government are now trying to think about how they might fund schemes which allows more public use, pays the landowner for the use of that land by the public, but the landowner retains ownership, and if in 20, 30 years' time there is a need for expansion, then the landowner still realises the value of that land for development.
Going quickly back to your question about how do you create parks, I think you do need some sort of strategic authority to create a substantial new park in London. The last example was the Olympic Park. If you leave it to land to be developed willy-nilly by individual developers, then unfortunately that everybody sort of pushes the green envelope down the line to somebody else. And so you need to take a strategic view of where you need new parks.
because obviously there's a tension in London between our housing need,
Yeah,
our need to
absolutely.
generate an economy. But when we redevelop places, what's the feeling there? Do people is delivering green space anywhere near the top of the agenda? Is there any example where it's done?
Well, I don't know if it is top of the agenda, but it should be on the agenda. It should be an essential prerequisite for any development that it creates some green space. And the policies in the London plan are there promoting it, but it's a question of whether they're strong enough. Obviously, that debate is happening in the London plan hearings, and whether they're enforced at the local level and development level. Everybody agrees that this is essential infrastructure. The more housing you build, the more green space you need. So it's absolutely should be an imperative for developers to ensure they're creating some public green space.
And I think the consideration thereafter is that that space that is provided isn't simply serve the purpose of enhancing the look and the feel of that development, but is actually accessible and available for people to make use of, and to for children to play and for people to sit out. That's an important consideration beyond that, for sure.
Can I just quickly give some examples of where the planning system has worked? So, Helen, I mean, the planning system provides a framework for discussion and negotiation, and sometimes that planning framework results in discussions and negotiations that don't quite come together for all sorts of reasons, isn't it? Political reasons, funding reasons, the development cycle. So sometimes it ends up in a not ideal outcome, and perhaps Nine Elms is one example of that. But equally, there are some really good examples of where those things have come together, the politics, the funding, the planning, to come up with some fantastic new developments and actually increase the amount of high-quality green space. And Kidbrooke Village in Greenwich is an example of that, which was the old Ferrier estate, which is a really poor quality estate that was demolished and removed. And now there's a fantastic new development with some really high-quality public open space, green space, where the developer is working with London Wildlife Trust to improve it for biodiversity. And it's an example where the planning system works very well. You can always find examples where the planning system hasn't.
But how do we capture that? Because obviously when we regenerate in London, it tends to mean densification, which means any green space gets looked upon as something that you could put even more on, housing-wise. How do we make that our culture? How do we knit that into the planning system? Because it's great that there's a good example, but I'm asking, I'm not telling here. What's the ratio of good examples to bad?
I think it's probably getting better,
Okay.
and the issue around densification. So you can densify by putting more buildings on a green space, or you can build taller. There's lots of now developments where the way in which it's designed means you can get higher density with good quality. I mean, you can do density very badly.
I understand all that, but the worry is that you can do that and then do it on top of a green space as well and get even more, and that seems to be the trend. I mean, if you look at policy, we've removed the protections from back gardens. The big debate now is how much green space is that going to lose. We only made the point that people put plastic over their driveways. I'll have to say one of my neighbours did it, but in his defence it was concrete, and then he put the fake grass over the concrete. So I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing. I don't know. When I said to him, why didn't you put grass there? He said, well, Sean, I'm just covering the concrete. I thought, fair enough, and I just sort of walked off. But my point is, we are now looking at removing back gardens, and they've been removed from the planning decision. People can just do it. Aren't we worried that that will lead to a loss?
Once we used to think builders' rubble in a garden was bad news. Now it's plastic and wholly concreted.
So I'm not a planning expert, but the new London Plan policy allows for development on small sites, which could include some gardens. But again, it comes down to the local authority makes the final planning decision. So there is options for the local authority to refuse those.
They've been taken out of that decision, aren't they?
Well, no, because part of it is a result of national planning policy. So the national planning policy framework allows for increased development without planning permission, effectively permitted development rights. Which is a national decision.
It's a local development.
And I think you need to get in touch with the government on that one.
I will do, I'm sure. But that's about a local thing, because what's interesting about green space, I think the real care for green space is driven by local people. The idea, people have as much love, or maybe even more love, for their small pocket park than they do for a big common that they think belongs to somebody else. Whereas these small spaces are really quite important. And I'm very interested in, A, how do we hold on to them, and B, how when we develop, we ask people as a matter of culture and as a matter of planning to give back, to save that space.
So again, through London Plan Policy, the urban greening factor requires new developers to ensure that they do a certain amount of greening in all new developments. The type of greening is dependent on a conversation between the local planning authority, the developer, the local community. You know, we're not going to dictate exactly how that should be transpire. And it will come down to individual negotiations. So in some parts of London where the requirement for additional housing may actually trump people's desire for additional greening. And this is just an anecdote. So I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday, and she's doing a lot of work in Thamesmead, and they did a consultation with local young people, local youth about space, and there's a community centre on the site with some green space, and they asked the local youth, do you like the green space? They said, yes, the green space is fine. And they said, well, how could you improve it? And they said, well, put a Burger King there. You know, so there are different views about
wisdom
how
takes
you use
time
space.
to
Yes, hopefully.
Can I just quickly ask this question? How is the GLA addressing areas of where there's areas of deficiency? How is that measured?
Yeah.
What would we be doing? What was interesting in the opening comments? Nobody mentioned children and play. My view of a park, particularly where I came from, the park basically replaced our lack of back gardens. We weren't particularly distressed about no back garden because we had 2 local parks. So how is it assessed, and how is it calculated? Where do we know this is?
So there's a framework for assessing deficiency in access to open space, and it's based on the distance of residential units from local parks, district parks and regional parks, and there's a threshold in terms of 400 metres to a local park. It used to be quite crude, just like drawing circles from residential. Now it's actually quite sophisticated, and it's actually 400 metres, taking out issues like barriers like railway lines. You know, 'cause in the old methodology, you could have a house that's within 50 metres of a park, but actually it's on the outside of the railway line, so you haven't got access. So it's much more sophisticated measuring. And that data is held by local authorities and by Green Space Information for Greater London. And London Plan Policy encourages, where there's new development, that those areas of deficiency are reduced where possible. I mean, clearly in some places it's not possible. So that the planning process and the planning system measures this and provides a mechanism to reduce areas of deficiency, but it comes down to negotiations around the development. I think the issue around children play is really interesting, and there's been a lot of focus on creating play space in local parks, and lots of local authorities do some really good stuff around play in parks, particularly trying to create natural play opportunities, so it's not just the sort of classic pieces of child play equipment. But actually a lot of the evidence suggests is that children want to play, particularly younger children, want to play very close to where they live. So that's more about how you start thinking about the public realm as play space. So again, the issue around how you reduce traffic in local streets, so children can actually play in the street. When I was a kid, I used to play football in the street because there were no cars. I'm old. So.
We're all focused on reducing car ownership, which...
Well, not car ownership, but the
if,
use of the space.
The unfortunate thing is, if you live in a street where people park their cars, they're going to want to park their car there. If they don't own the car, you're in a better space on that.
Yeah, it's not a solution that can work everywhere, but where, particularly where regeneration is occurring, there are ways in which you can redesign the street layout to provide lots more areas of public realm which become playable space, and that's the critical thing. You can have a park 400 metres away that's got a fantastic playground, but as a 4-year-old child or a 5-year-old child, you may have to cross 3 or 4 busy roads. You're not going to go and play in that space. You need play space immediately outside your residence, and that's about courtyards, it's about parklets, it's about playable streets.
Rear alleyways is a particular opportunity in suburban areas where you can gate these alleyways off. They very often become overgrown and unused. You hand the keys to those gates to the local residents, and suddenly, as part of that, not only does the antisocial behaviour that was prevalent disappear, but actually they become very valued, very local, and very accessible green open spaces at the back of people's gardens, and that's a common approach.
It sounds like a good use of space. Another just a question that maybe Helen or Tony, anybody can answer. I've noticed in a few local parks that I walk past, there seems to be schools using them. And is that a new phenomenon? Is it a welcome phenomenon? Is it?
It's I don't think it's a new phenomenon exactly, although I think as pressure has gone on to create new housing, and then that in itself creates the need for new schools, and the new schools can't afford land other than playgrounds in caged roofs. What happens is they look to the park to produce the sports day and the running track, etc. And that's quite a good use of the park during the day, but then it prevents other uses of the park during the day. So it's a part of a picture, a complex picture, where new academies are effectively relying on public services through parks to provide their sports space.
Just because, is that just the reality of there being, as we grow to 10 million people? Because it struck me, mainly because the children seem to be having an absolute riot of a time, that it was a good thing. There was 30 or 40 of them, they were having a good time, they were using the equipment in the park, which many times in the daytime is not being used at all. I didn't get the impression they were preventing other people from using the park, because normally when I walk past the park it's empty at that time of day. So I just want to get your feel for, is that a welcome development or not?
Yeah, in Parks for London, we for a number of years have been encouraging, we try to break down the silos between the different departments in local government. And so we've been trying to talk to education to say, use your parks. They're great learning resources, not just for sports, but for learning. And there's a degree of resistance by some simply because health and safety, distance, lack of staff and all that jazz. So I think that's an untapped resource. I think what has been, and that kind of use has gone on for donkeys, but what there has been a growth in is the use of parks by young children, playgroups and the likes for forest schools, and that is burgeoning. And there are some local authorities that have reached agreements with these forest schools, and they come in on a regular basis and use the park for teaching and learning, which is great. So I think it's something that should be encouraged.
Yeah, it's great. And obviously you grow a group of children who then become adults who have a much better appreciation for the park and use it more.
Absolutely, but then it goes back to the elephant in the room that we were discussing about funding. That's offsetting the education budget. It's not supporting the park. So the park's being used, but it's not getting any benefits in reverse to maintain it properly. So there's a sort of mismatch there.
So parks and green spaces are performing a whole range of statutory functions, and this is why there's a national campaign for parks to become a statutory service, be recognised as a statutory service and be funded from central government substantially. And part of the documents that I've handed to you, which I want to make sure are on the record, is the Charter for Parks, which has been launched by a number of national organisations, calling for parks to become a statutory service, and a range of other issues.
Can I ask you a question? So in the conversation we just had about other users using the park, its membership going through the roof, in your mind, Dave, I suspect I know the answer to this, are we at the point where park use is so high that it should be addressed in that way? Should it become a statutory service, a centrally funded service, because the use is so high, or are we still on that journey?
No, we're still on the journey. I mean, the point is, parks, you can always have wider and more usage of public green space, but they need to be properly resourced and staffed.
I get that,
and have the right range of facilities.
But there's a point where if the usage is so high, that's undeniable. That's what I'm saying.
I don't think we've reached that
what
stage.
you're discussing a bit is desire line. So there's a park near me where the intensity of usage has effectively forced a new path to be created. Now, over time, that gets more and more, and that gets to be more hard standing, and eventually you have little pocket parks either side rather than a proper green space. And again, there's something else that Peter said that I wanted to sort of pick up on, which is I love green roofs, don't get me wrong.
Not a substitute.
We raise money through opening them up to the public through Open Garden Squares weekend every year, so I think they're fantastic. But they are not a substitute for the play spaces that are provided in parks,
I would
etc.
not suggest they're a substitute.
No.
They're an alternative in places where you
I'm
can't
going to let you
get
move
parks.
on, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Tony, can I bring you in
Yes,
to...
you can. I quite like the point that you've just made about access to green roofs and so on not being a substitute. What I'd really like to know is, what is the difference between a green space and a park? Well, tell me.
Well, all parks are green spaces, but not all green spaces are parks. I think is probably the simplest way of putting it. A green space can be a strip of land on a housing estate. It can be a tree in the middle of a roundabout. It can be
A common.
exactly a common.
A heath.
Exactly. I mean,
Can it be a wall?
Potentially there is an example I can think of where there is an historic wall from a capability brown landscape that has a small strip of grass next to it, which is the last relic of a particular capability brown landscape, which I would regard as sort of green space, and it has greenery growing out of it. But the use of it, one could argue, is very limited in terms of amenity value, but great in terms of biodiversity and value and sense of place. So it's about the value you put on a particular space.
Golf course.
Yes, that is a green space, or the oval cricket ground is a green space on a map, but does anybody get to use it other than the cricketers? No. But it gives a lot of joy.
All right, let me explain. I really want to explore the green wall.
Yeah.
Now, we've had lots
Get you
of
another.
discussions in relation to the evolving London plan, and we are told that green walls could be a substitute for loss of I suppose, green space in the sense of gardens and things of that kind. And I have to say, I find that quite difficult unless you're Spider-Man or something like that for the green wall to be as much use to an individual as a garden. But let us suppose a green wall is put up. Who is responsible for the green wall? I think this is a question for you.
It depends who owns the wall.
Absolutely.
Well, that's exactly the point. If a planning consent is given, and I appreciate that for something small of this kind, it's going to be the local planning authority, doesn't there need to be some control to see that the green wall is maintained?
Absolutely. And it's exactly...
And does that work?
The argument you're making is exactly the same whether it's a green wall or a green roof or a new piece of public open space. I'm
going to come on to the rooms in a minute. But the open space, I suggest to you, is likely to be much easier to maintain than a green wall where the roots have gone or the thing isn't properly watered or something like that. And in effect, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there really is no substitute for terra firma.
It's about use, because the green wall contributes to air pollution mitigation, and it detracts from, it sort of covers up a whole set of sins from architects in terms of ugly buildings and etc. But I agree with you that in terms of amenity value and social cohesion, a green wall is no substitute. So it really depends. I think it's not an either or. It's an and. It's part of a mixed picture for biodiversity, for climate mitigation, etc.
I think no one's suggesting that we replace parks with green walls. So where green walls have worked very effectively, if you go around the City of London now, there are some fantastic green walls. They're adding green infrastructure to the urban environment.
You say that, but I can refer to debates that we've had here, debates initiated by me, indeed even questions of the Mayor, which says, when it's talking about proposals within the London plan, that one way of dealing with loss of green space, terra firma green space, is the provision of green walls. And I'm suggesting, and I think you've confirmed, that it is an addition, not a substitution.
Yes.
Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair.
All right. And under those circumstances, it's really a kind of delusion to suggest that green walls should be part, if you like, of the any kind of park strategy.
It's not part of the park strategy. Where green, so the urban greening factor is designed so where there's regeneration going on, where there's new development, and London Plan protects existing parks and green spaces.
Okay, so when a developer comes along, and I can think of a couple of cases, developer comes along and says, yes, it's perfectly true, we are going to be building on this backland here, but in return, in terms of area covered by greenness, I am providing all of these extra green walls, and therefore that is a substitute. You would say that ought not to be a substitute.
It depends on the circumstances. I mean,
No. Seriously, can a green wall, which I thought you had just conceded,
yeah.
can a green wall be a substitute for flat land?
No.
Of which parks grow?
It depends on. So there's plenty of examples of bits of green space which have got very, very poor use and value, and a greening solution may actually provide better value. A good example of that is the issue around air quality. So you may have a strip of grass next to a busy road, which has no function, no purpose, other than being a strip of grass between the road and the pavement. And replacing that with a green wall, particularly adjacent to a school, may actually provide more benefits than the piece of grass there in the first place.
Yeah, but the two things don't match. You're not suggesting that the school is built in the middle of a road, it's got this little piece of land in front of it. You're simply talking about a strip of land which is sort of isolated, aren't you? And you're saying a green wall is better than that.
It
Depends on the context and the circumstance.
Okay. What I believe I've got the concession. Let me ask your colleagues. I believe I've got the concession. Can a green wall ever be a substitute for? Thank you. That's what I want to know. And the second thing that I'd like to say, which isn't on my list, which has arisen from what you've said and from this document that has been circulated about the number of friends and groups who are involved. Who are involved in this. If a local planning authority, if a borough decides to make parks a priority, it's going to do infinitely more than any London plan or anything we do here. And can I suggest a London borough, and it's borne out completely by this, a London borough which, to my knowledge, has hardly ever restricted expenditure on parks, indeed is constantly investing money in parks, which is Richmond upon Thames, on the basis that parks are indeed the most important amenity that they have. And I look at this, and I see the number of groups, and I look at the number of friends, and which seems to bear that out. Ought not the task to be, and I suggest this to you, Chairman, that we should be saying to the London boroughs, you know, really this ought to be a number one thing. And as a rider to that, again from memory, I think that right across London, when they do these surveys of satisfaction with council services, parks, particularly in places like Richmond, is well in excess of 90%, which bears out, I think, the points that you're making. And I'm really quite impressed by this. That says parks are the number one good thing for living. And that really ought to be a conclusion I would suggest that we come to from this meeting.
I don't think I disagree with that.
It's a rhetorical question. Because manifesto, you must agree.
Yeah. So.
Well, I think we would all agree that parks are a vital component to London, and that's why we're all passionate about it.
But this is the proof.
Yeah. Well,
it's the point I've just made about if a
there
borough goes hell for leather.
Yeah.
Yes, Dave, quickly, and then Tony, Tony.
Yeah.
After that, could you ask the question that you were going to be asking?
Thank you. Yeah, I know. Let me do that. Let me do that before you answer.
I think this committee, which is the political committee, should take a very strong line on the importance of parks, how they're essential, how they should be properly funded, how that local boroughs should have the resources in order to be able to fund them and manage their parks and staff their parks properly, and also to work in partnership with their local friends groups, which are an essential component of these essential services. And obviously this list that's provided actually from Parks for London, but I've provided it, shows there's nearly 700 groups that local authorities are recognising as friends groups. Probably the number's greater. And there are other groups as well that are also involved with parks. So just want to say the principle of community empowerment and in being involved in the decision making, the activities, the maintenance, the management of a green space should be an essential part of the recommendations out of this committee.
And I also think that you're absolutely right. There is a job across London for managers of parks to understand what the good aspects of the engagement are within boroughs like Richmond and upon Thames and replicate that approach more widely. I think that's a very serious consideration.
But there are developmental issues even for Richmond which go beyond the borough. So, for instance, the views are jeopardised by serious tall buildings in central London. And so those historic views are going to be lost forever.
Anyway, the questions I have been specifically asked to ask you, one gets carried away.
See.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. What innovative steps can be taken to ensure green spaces provide, one, the benefits to Londoners and increase usability, and two, are maintained to protect biodiversity.
Are there any innovative steps that haven't been covered so far?
And you've covered one which I'd never heard of before, which is absolutely staggering to me. I think that you mentioned it, Helen, that some local authorities are paying for access to the green belt. Somebody mentioned it.
Wasn't me.
But somebody did. I made a note of it.
So that was.
I think. Did you say in relation to Enfield?
No. So that's in Enfield. So Enfield own quite a lot of farmland, and they're now beginning to think about the future use of that land, because as farming in the green belt's not particularly in terms of food production, it's not particularly significant. So can that land be used better to provide better public benefits, i.e. in terms of access, public access? Similar to the model that's been happening in East London for a long time with the community forest, turning agricultural land into woodland and parks and green spaces to provide quite significant recreational areas. And Enfield are exploring how they can take agricultural land, which is in and around Trent Park, and effectively expanding the offer of Trent Park by making that more publicly accessible.
There's a key point.
So
is the paying bit.
Yeah. So government are currently looking at it's called the new environmental land management scheme. So post Brexit, and we won't discuss if or when that happens. With the land will no longer get funding from the European Union through common agricultural policy. Government is committed to providing an alternative funding mechanism, and it's the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And government, and particularly Michael Gove, has been saying that future subsidy, which is effectively what it is, should be paying for public goods rather than an agricultural subsidy. So governments are devising a new land management scheme which will pay landowners to deliver public goods, and that can be flood management, it can be public access. So if you currently farm or manage land in the greenbelt, in the future you may be paid a regular payment to make that land available for public benefit.
So it doesn't happen already then?
No, not really.
Okay, thank you. That's the innovative thing.
Sure.
Does anyone else have anything sort of innovative in terms of managing to make green space available?
Well, I just want to say one thing. It is innovative if it's spread throughout all parks, but we have the Green Flag Award status. I think the innovative approach to that is to try to achieve Green Flag status for every public green space, and some boroughs are adopting that policy, that is their aspiration. So I think having a standard by which we can measure every green space, does it actually achieve all the benefits that it should be? And the other thing I was going to suggest, it's not a new idea, the Fields in Trust Protection Covenant, which protects a green space for all time, forever, in perpetuity, And up till recently, this has been a drip approach. There's now 2,700 such spaces across the country, the UK, that are protected by Fields and Trust covenants. And some boroughs are taking the approach that actually they would like all of their public green space to be protected. And in Haringey, I've included, you were referring to it, a document from the Environmental Scrutiny Committee, a little bit similar to this committee here, but at a borough level, where the action really does take place at the borough level. But the Scrutiny Committee is recommending that Haringey Council achieve green flag for all parks that are capable of achieving it, and also that all parks be protected for all time. So this is a kind of long-term way of looking at our parks and green spaces as essential, but they've got to be managed to a certain standard.
Can I also add that in terms of innovation, I think one thing that's often overlooked about the value of parks is things like the right to light, because there's right to light within your housing, but there is no right to light within a park, and therefore you can put as tall a building as you like all round parks, and then they become rather darkened courtyards. And the other thing is noise mitigation.
Can I just...
Noise mitigation, you mean from passing traffic or overhead
so
planes?
it's very rare in London that you can get away from noise and get to tranquility.
Yeah.
I think just generally I'd promote the concept of soft landscaping as integral to traffic engineering and not as an afterthought. I think the City of Sheffield are particularly forward-looking authority in that regard, and may be a good example. So, twinning traffic engineering with the extension of our parks and open spaces is important.
There's really good examples in Waltham Forest. They had the Mini Holland Fund, and they've actually done some fantastic projects around greening streets effectively.
And I've just seen in Highbury Corner they're putting in some of the biggest suds areas under what will be a public space that's connecting a green space to the station. So various geeky people like me kind of peering through the railings looking at these acres of sustainable drainage. Navin, can I bring you in now,
Yeah,
please?
well, you'll be pleased to know I haven't got anything controversial like green walls. But on that subject, I was looking up, there's actually a GLA report, a recent one, which is titled Living Roofs and Walls. And it's got 3 categories of walls: green, living walls, and biodiversity facades. Makes very interesting reading, so something for the next kind of consideration. Coming to my sort of line of questioning, I've got 2 questions about enhancement of green space provision, and that's looking at quality of life as well as accessibility. Then I want to sort of run with questions about mayoral sort of strategies and interventions. So moving on to the specific questions, how can green space provision be enhanced to maximize quality of life benefits? There's to panel. Any specific?
Okay, I think there's a strong connection between quality of the green space with quality of life. You think back to the broken window syndrome. If a place isn't well maintained, it's actually going to put people off going there. And we know that some spaces are not being managed as much as they ought to be because there isn't enough revenue funded for them. And this is what Parks for London is most concerned about. It's about the quality of the green spaces. Dave made reference just now to Green Flag Awards, which is a national, in fact an international award for quality. I would say it's a baseline. But actually, looking across London, only 26% of London's parks actually have Green Flag Awards. And now that's partly because it's a voluntary award that you apply for, and some boroughs choose not to do that. But it is worrying that only 26% of spaces have that award. So there's a lot of work to do. And then linking back to the last question about innovation, I think there's been a lot of good work that's been done in the past that has been lost. such as the outreach work that staff in parks would do with children and young people. For example, Southwark used to run a whole programme for developing young friends of parks, which was brilliant, but it's been lost for lack of funding. Outreach workers in terms of rangers involving the community with understanding their biodiversity, they've been lost. Even, dare I say, sort of police or security staff whose job descriptions have been changed over the years, that they're, rather than keep away, they're more interactive. That's been lost. Brilliant programmes where the police used to get involved in summer programmes of sports held in parks, which I believe has used to help reduce knife crime, for example, lost. So all those innovative things have been lost because the funding is not sustainable. And so the innovation, needs to be actually in the finance. And it's and there's one ray of hope, I believe, through Treasury, is that their understanding and acceptance of the green, help me Peter, the natural capital accounting, because they will actually understand those figures. So I think there is a ray of hope in the future in terms of both innovation that will open opportunities to enhance our green spaces. But I think for the limited funding that we have, I'm seeing the biggest bang for the bucks is where it's focused in small amounts at local communities. It gets them engaged, it gets them on board, and they can do so much more. They're so much more passionate about their local spaces, and that I think is where enhancement can take place. They'll need some structure, some management from the landowners, mainly the local authorities, and that's essential too. But I've seen over the last few decades a coming together of the friends groups movement and those that own and manage parks to work together now, much more than in the past where it was antagonistic. And so where we look at every borough under 10 categories under this annual report, we're seeing the successful and innovative local authorities are those that are engaging with their local communities. And it's sometimes as simple as organising events, small-scale events which aren't necessarily charged for. It's curating events, it's animating the spaces, so they're doing much more than just sitting there waiting for somebody to come and use them. People are going into them, getting them active.
I reiterate a lot of that as well. I think an important means of enhancing our green open spaces is to ensure a regular and familiar presence within our parks. That doesn't just support the maintenance and the upkeep, but it does give a sense of ownership and presence that helps make people more comfortable and secure within these parks as well. So an enhancement would be, where possible, ensuring a familiar presence within those parks on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Having a dedicated person for a specific green space, you can build a whole lot around that person in terms of monitoring what's going on, reporting, interaction with the community, liaising with contractors that are coming in and out, and this is something that was standard practice until the 80s, and councils need the resources to be able to bring that back. It's incredible. You couldn't run a library without a staff. You couldn't run. I mean, this is essential infrastructure we're talking about for every community. It must have the resources in order to, fulfil its function. And I think this committee needs to take a stand on that. And can I just say that we are putting pressure on government nationally, and I've included, just for the record, here a recent statement by the Minister for Parks. There never used to be a Minister for Parks until a couple of years ago, and now there's negotiations going on, and this particular statement by the Minister, April 2019, in response to what the Parks Action Group really has been lobbying for within that relationship, basically talks about everything except for the key issue. The elephant in the room is what the government's going to do to provide the proper funding, but that discussion is happening, long-term ring-fence funding for parks and green spaces.
No, but together it's tough. volunteers as well can and do play a major role.
But again, we're not a substitute for proper stuff. We're an add-on value.
It isn't, but you come across a lot of stakeholder groups, individuals who are very passionate about enhancing their parks and facilities, etc. So they can be actually leaders, local ambassadors to push the local staff if there is any, which is what I support that. I'm not saying it's one instead of the other. It's a question of how volunteers can also take that leading role.
Definitely. Yeah. I was going to say, I think volunteers take a very active role in their green spaces. They're passionate about it, but I also think that it's not necessarily the whole solution. So there is a temptation for local authorities to then divest themselves of assets to volunteer sector, third sector organisations, and that has yet to be proven to work long-term sustainably. Local authorities seem to be the most stable model.
If we can move on to my next question, Peter, do come in probably on this one and the previous one. Helen, you already mentioned in terms of access, refugees, BME communities, and Chris, you mentioned in the earlier comments community cohesion, sort of, which again involves the whole diversity that we have in London. So the question is again, like the previous one, how can green space provision enhance and ensure accessibility to all?
Well, I think green space is theoretically accessible to all and makes no difference. We're all human beings, we all have basic needs, and those needs are fulfilled by well-being. However, there does seem to be a disparity from anecdotal evidence in usage depending on the areas you go to, and I think there is a perception that needs to be broken down. Most friends groups tend to be of a certain demographic, I'm afraid, and a certain age, and the solution for that I haven't quite got to, but I do think there needs to be some kind of more strategic thinking about how we change attitudes to volunteering in parks within BAME and younger people's views.
I think that's right. I mean, the starting point for all of this really is very simple. It's to keep our parks clean, safe and well maintained, and provide an appropriate range of facilities, looking at, particularly in terms of the age group, a playful environment for young children, right through to toilet facilities and the like for older people. So, those are very important considerations.
Mobility, sensory sort of issues are critical as well, something which needs to be part of the culture, the policies, which I'm not sure is the case. That is something certainly that needs to be looked into.
I think also there was a debate that happened last night as part of Chelsea Fringe that I was at, where there is a perception that horticulture is a low-value career, and I think that also has some sort of barrier in that people are expected to do a year's internship that's very cheap, and then there's sort of very low-level NVQ levels that don't get them high pay, and so there's a perception that managing parks isn't that worthwhile, and I think again that's something that needs to be overcome. There's a big shortage of horticultural schools within London, and it opens up another whole debate, but there's a big sort of underselling of the value of horticulture and horticultural skills, and local authorities, with the best will, Peter, I know you say local authorities have to negotiate individually. Local authorities just don't have those skills within the planning departments and elsewhere.
Peter?
Well, I was just going to make a point about, I guess it goes down to part of the issue around how parks are currently used or designed is a reflection of the core interest groups who have been involved in parks for many years are sports groups or people who are interested in landscape, and they tend to be from particular parts of society. So how to engage young people in parks, and it goes down to the issue around sort of contested space. So lots of local authorities have begun to rethink how they provide facilities in park, and perhaps moving away from the traditional football pitch and providing a skate park or a Monger. Quite often there's a pushback from the existing users of the park, so it is about how you identify what needs are.
Multi-use
Sorry,
games.
multi-use games area. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
So it's about identifying what are the needs in that local park and who is your core audience. And there's I think as Helen mentioned earlier, there's lots of opportunity using data and mapping, and there's going to be a new web-based tool released later this summer called Greenkeeper, which provides much more rich data around who lives close to a park, who's got access via public transport, so you can begin to understand the park in the context of the demographics of the local community, the accessibility via public transport, and then begin to make decisions about how that park might be designed and managed in the future to meet different needs. But that's very much about a local authority, because it's the local authorities who have that information, that granular information about where the park is, what the local community requirements are, and how you match those two things up.
I'm also very minded that biodiversity is a very good starting point for all of this as well. And that is something that, managed in the right way, presented in the right way, can really inspire, enthusiasm, stoke up curiosity and start a lifelong learning path for the community as well. So I would very much see biodiversity as a starting point for creating those sorts of enhancements and those opportunities for the general public.
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing? It's having a friends group and getting the community involved gives a sense of ownership, and that can change the atmosphere to a green space where it's seen as a kind of a sort of a desert in terms of the community, even if it's used, unless there's some kind of organised presence. There's a presence, there'll be a website, there'll be meetings that people can attend, there'll be an email list they can join, notice boards, for example, we run the notice boards, lots of friends groups run the notice boards, councils don't have the staff anymore to animate those notice boards, more events that are community events. So there's a real change in perception by the community that feel this is their local space, and that can lead to all kinds of things down the line, more activities, more groups. And
Actually moving into some of the stuff that we covered in our final section, so if we can let Navin keep going.
Okay.
I wasn't sure what the question was.
No, well, access and enhancement of green space. No, I think we've covered, I think, generally the aspects that I thought would be raised. Moving swiftly on to document which Dave has through that flagged up a couple of mayor's pledges, and that is number 5, which talks about mayor's pledge to make London the first national park city. Then following from that, number 6, where the mayor pledged that was to set a long-term target to make more than 50% of our city green and ensure that all children have access to nature. Peter, if I can start with you, what is the role of National Park City Scheme in principle, and forthcoming National Park City Festival as well, and how are these plans coming together?
So the National Park City was something which was a campaign that was run, initiated 2 or 3 years ago during the last mayoral elections, and I think all the candidates who stood for election supported the idea of London becoming a National Park City. And essentially, the National Park City is a movement. It's a way of engaging a lot more people with London's parks and green spaces, and demonstrating that they have value in terms of health and well-being, but there's lots of opportunities in London to do fantastic things outdoors, whether it's playing football in the park, walking your dog, taking your children to the playground, or more sort of niche things like paddleboarding on the Thames or parkour in the public realm. So it's trying to stimulate people's interest in the outdoors. And it goes back to a point that Dave made about 20, 30 years ago, perhaps parks were used a lot more. I think that's partly because there were less other distractions. A lot of us spend a lot of time now indoors in front of a computer screen. So it's about trying to make people aware of the fantastic opportunities available in the great outdoors, in London's parks and green spaces, and encourage particularly younger people to make use of that rather than perhaps some of the more modern day preoccupations of computer screens or retail therapy, those kind of things.
Do you think the sort of draft London plan, so there's enough in it to sort of achieve this target of 50% green?
Yeah, so effectively to achieve that 50%, more than 50% of London being green requires protection of the existing network of parks and open spaces, and the London plan sets that out. It says that parks and green spaces, metropolitan land, green belts should be protected. And then introduces the urban greening factor, which says that all new developments should contribute additional greening in those developments. And that's a new policy. Previous policy was an encouragement to incorporate things like green roofs. This is now actually saying all developments must do a certain amount of greening. And that's we can do that now because the way we green developments has come on hugely in the last 10 years. So installing things like sustainable drainage, much more effective tree planting pits, green roofs, green walls, unfortunately, they've become much more technically well developed, and I take Tony's point. You know, a green wall built 10 years ago quite often died. Green walls now, there's some fabulous green walls and green roofs. So the ability for developers and architects to incorporate greening into developments has come on leaps and bounds. So we think the policy framework will result in a greener London, and it's backed up by things like Healthy Streets, which is about transforming the public realm.
Dave, do you want to comment on this aspect of National Park City?
No, just to say that it's not just a movement to encourage people to get out into open space, it's also about raising the profile of green space across London so that it's seen as essential infrastructure, as we've all said, but now it's badged London-wide through this National Park City kind of, framework, if you like. That can only be a good thing, but what we say is it should lead to real commitment to our parks and green spaces from everybody in London that they've got to be properly protected and properly financed.
Do you think the Mayor has managed to raise the bar in that respect?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's it's not so much the Mayor. The Mayor's accepted the lobbying that's the movement that's built up, which has been unstoppable. Everybody agrees it's a really good thing, and now the whole world is looking at London as the very first world, a national park city, and all over the world people are saying, well, we want to turn X, Y, Z, their cities into national parks.
And to you and every other members of the panel, and do you think that London plan, those changes do actually support and would sort of speed up the green city concept?
So I think we would all endorse the fact that raising the agenda of parks on the political map is very important, and National Park City has certainly played its place. I just don't know if I would say it has teeth in certain areas, and it goes back to my concern over creeping memorialisation, and particular Victoria Tower Gardens, but also the one I mentioned in Hampstead Heath, and the fact that parks are still used to be changed in terms of their use into places that don't necessarily offer the maximum values for amenity, social cohesion, etc. So I think the aspiration is there. I think a lot of it is good, but I think in specific areas it's still missing, and it's missing a few tricks.
Is a cemetery a park?
It depends. So Brompton Cemetery and Highgate Cemetery, the Magnificent Seven, are certainly places where people go to get relaxation. But it depends what you mean by a park. So if you're wanting to kick a football about, I'd say, no, that's the wrong place. And cycling and things. So it's...
Really, the point I was getting at, I do take your point about Victoria Tower Gardens, because that's obviously a monster monument that they're putting in there, and puts the whole thing out of kilter. But on the other hand, having a memorial in the park does not stop it from being a park. Contrariwise, having lots of monuments, i.e. in a cemetery, could mean that
Absolutely.
it's still a park.
No, absolutely, and that is the complexity of managing all green space in London. Is that it's
but it is an open space. It
Yes.
comes back to your
Green
earlier
space.
point. Green
Green
space.
space.
Because
We can agree.
Streatham Cemetery has
green
got
space
they
as
keep
well.
bees in Streatham Cemetery, and they've got many bats. So the open space element of cemeteries, because also people don't disturb them, so you can get very good biodiversity because it tends to be undisturbed. Because some people find it offensive, the idea of people going in and digging up the monuments and the graves for obvious reasons.
Yes.
Natalie, you done?
Yeah, I'm done. Thank you, Chair.
Marvellous. Sean, you were indicating we're getting quite tight on time.
Yeah, indeed.
Is it crucial or
It's crucial.
be speedy and
No, it isn't.
concise,
So
and then I'll
to
bring
Peter,
David
'cause it's a
in.
yes or no. Has the mayor considered using TFO advertising to promote parks?
Not that I'm aware of. no.
Okay, that's number one. The green flag thing, you said there's lots of work to be done, but there's a bit of a contradiction in what you said, because you said a lot of local authorities don't pursue it, so they may already have green flag level parks, but we don't know.
Yes, good point.
Also, does it cost money to use green flag?
To the application process, but it's
That
not
would be
huge
your
amounts. But
barrier
that,
entry right there,
Yeah.
I imagine. And this is a personal thing. Why do parks have fences around them? I find it intensely annoying.
Not all parks do. Lots have hedgerows around them. Frequently, it's particularly in inner London. It's about preventing inappropriate behaviour, particularly at night in the nighttime economy. An example is Vauxhall Gardens versus Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. They're very close to each other, but the crime rate in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens is substantially more because that is not fenced, whereas Vauxhall Park is fenced. So it's about managing different types of behaviours.
Okay.
Can I just very quickly come in on that? I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, and part of the sort of philosophy around green infrastructure is to sort of blur the boundaries between park and public realm, and actually fences are actually quite important sometimes because they are a defensible space, but by and large, and the Olympic Park's a really good example. The Olympic Park doesn't have fences. It's trying to make sure that the parkland is part of the wider public realm, so people don't see it as a separate space.
I think that's probably around how it's conceived in the first
absolutely.
place.
Well, it's a historical thing.
Because if you have a park that was conceived to be fenced off, it's turned its back to everything else. It becomes a private space. As antisocial behaviour needs secrecy normally. So I just find I find fences around parks quite hostile, and the parks that are used the most. It's why commons are often quite, because you just sort of happen to be on the common when you step off the curb. I think going forward, that should be part of our.
No, I don't think it should be. I don't think you should have a policy on this, because I think there are many spaces where people are strongly committed to the places being closed at night for a whole range of reasons.
It's not a policy.
I just want to say that
it's not a policy about a fence. It's a policy about overall master planning. That's what I'm looking at, rather than policy.
Because I don't think the fence is necessarily a barrier. It depends on the hedgerows around it, etc. And it's about visibility lines rather than the fence, the physical entity of the fence itself. And often it's part of the historic integrity of the park. You know, the iron fence is going away during the World War to create tanks, etc. I mean, you know, that has emotive issues going back quite a long way. So fences can be beautiful as well.
Someone just needs to look at it.
Sean, I'm going to close this down. We could go down the rabbit hole of fences for hours. David, could I bring you in this final section? We've ranged so widely that we may have covered some of the issues in this final section. But David, over to you.
It's been great listening to you all so far, and we talked a lot about local councils and government, and also the friends groups. But I want to bring it back to the people who use the parks. I mean, so my first question is, what do you think people and communities can do to increase the benefit that they get themselves from the parks that they use? Is it to?
So are you wanting to find out what users would get more out of if we did more?
Yeah. I mean,
so
how do you know? Obviously, there's different reasons why people use the parks.
Yes.
So is it, perhaps I'm thinking more. What sort of uses could the parks be put to? I mean, how can the people that actually use the parks in the local communities? I mean, how would that enhance the parks? What benefits would they get out of it if they use parks in a different way?
I mean, I think it's chicken and egg. You know, if you provide certain facilities, you attract certain people. So if you provide an outdoor gym in our park, an outdoor gym, it's incredibly popular. even till midnight. People are in there, you know, doing their pulling up and and stuff. And you know, so did we know that there was a demand for that beforehand? You know, to get those people into the park rather than to pay to go to a commercial gym. Lots of people now come into the park. In fact, all ages, kids go on it and everything. And so, but my experience in my own park, Lord Shipwreck, is that you can transform the usage of a park, and there's a whole different way you can attract people. And obviously, facilities, staffing, resources, and so on, but also having a whole range of activities for different sections of the population, and also groups. So by encouraging people to form specific groups that they're passionate about, whether it's a dog walking group, I don't mean professional, I mean, you know, local people with dogs, or like you say, people, a play group coming into the park as part of their activities, you can get a wider range of activities going on in that park. It's chicken and egg of whether that comes first, whether the people come in first and then you provide the facilities, or the other way round. So,
I guess when it's up and running, people will know it's there and they'll go and do it. But it's, you know, who's the best to start it up? I suppose it could be either. It could be the local people, or it could be the local council.
I'll take an example of a local council, you know, taking that programme forward is the London Borough of Islington, and they offer up service level agreements whereby, you know, they offer the maintenance of anything from a flower bed to large areas of the park to local community groups who are willing to sign up on that basis. They provide some funding to support that work, and not only does that sort of, you know, foster that enthusiasm, that local involvement, it actually ensures that particular park is very well maintained and managed. So it's, you know,
and there's real community. I come from Islington, and there's real community ownership of those spaces that are managed under those service level agreements. And it's not that the volunteers are being paid to do the work, but they're getting support and funding which actually provides them with tools and a bit of structure to actually help them to keep doing that maintenance work. And it seems to just give those groups a bit of underpinning, and it seems to be working. But I think they shouldn't be thought of as, you know, cheap labour, exactly. It's got to. It works if it's done in a way that enables the group to function well.
And they can't fulfil all the functions. So grass mowing, etc. You need major bits of equipment, and so on and so forth. So you can't expect them to do everything.
So back to you, David.
How about some community events and maybe seasonal events? I mean, is there? What more can be done sort of in terms of those things? We have things at Christmas, obviously. We have things in the summer as well, when the sun's shining. I mean, is there anything that could be done in that sort of line? That
Friends groups often do run community events. Some of the traditional summer fete, or schools often use parks for summer fetes, etc. That does happen. There are some barriers depending on the local authority, because there is some fees often attached to getting licence for the park to be used for that particular day. But on the whole, local authorities are pretty supportive of that. The problem is there's a creeping commercialisation until you get to the sort of the bigger extremes of Udderbelly and Oktoberfest that used to be in Kennington Park, or SW4 in Clapham, or there are some other ones north of the river as well. And then the local community don't really get a huge amount of it. The local authority obviously gets some money in commercially, but only today there was a thing on a group of parks managers about how Clapham Common, and that's why I mentioned it, has had so much intensive use over so many years. They're now going to have to strip away the land and replant, and so you have to question how much the commercialisation has actually added value to the park, because certainly in terms of noise impact for the residents and loss of amenity value for the residents over the years, it's been a lot, but it also does seem to have had a long-term impact on the park, which hasn't been sufficiently compensated.
So there can be some overuse.
But in terms of encouraging people in from the local community, I think local authorities should make it as attractive as possible. They shouldn't be charging for community events, and I don't think local authorities tend to charge for community events. I mean, Certainly not for friends groups, in my experience. They should definitely not charge for friends groups, because the whole point is to get the park better used and the community empowered and involved. But there is a lot of bureaucracy in terms of organising events and having to fill out a 16-page form. And I don't know if anyone's been looking into streamlining
They
that.
can't get through because there's legal requirements the authority has to fulfil. Because I used to run a charity and our local authority were very generous to the park. They would provide stewards and all sorts, but you still needed to fill in the form.
So what we've done in Parks for London is we've looked at good practice across the boroughs in terms of events from the small scale to the large scale. We've again developed a generic policy and a process for boroughs to follow through. I've also been involved in a number of scrutiny committees who are specifically looking at the whole issue of events.
So is that a generic events policy?
Yes.
And so you've looked at, because we talked about this the last time around, and we had Simon Ingnon and somebody from Barnet talking about the various different events policies. So you've now got
we brought it together. It's available on our website.
Guide, and that's on your Parks.
It's on our website. It's a bit buried, but I can give the committee staff a link.
Sorry to interrupt.
So no. Thank you for raising it. I think the thing is that. Because of resources back at the coal face, the ability to do a lot of these things we've been thinking about are quite restricted. And so I'm concerned that a lot of park services are so understaffed and underfunded. All they're doing is firefighting, because they've got to keep the grass cut, they've got to keep the litter off, and they've got to try and keep the 2 toilets open. That is all that's left. And whilst all that's important, what we're encouraging local authorities to do is be far more strategic about the way they run their services, to think big and to be holistic, and above all to collaborate with one another in different boroughs. That is gradually happening, and there's some excellent good practice going on, but it's not known about. So that's, again, I'll plug this because we bring it out in this yearly.
So would you say it's less about enabling volunteering and community work and more about developing a collaborative approach with the various and a big range of community groups?
Absolutely. Well, there are the stakeholder groups for parks are ginormous. You think of the potential users that are out there. So it's a complex management thing. And getting back to the point earlier about charging for some of these uses, it's not about actually making the money. It's about finding a way of regulating them and making sure that they're not taking over a space and stopping another user from using it. So professional dog walkers, for example. So it's balancing all these things. And I think where boroughs are doing well, they are listening to the communities that use them, they're engaging with them. And that's the process that's, although austerity is terrible, it has made people go back to basic principles and work alongside each other, which didn't happen so much in the past.
I think, from a borough perspective, I agree totally with that. I think the starting point on this process that's very often, overlooked is that local needs assessment. So that's the establishing very clearly and firmly what the local requirements are, what people want to do in the parks, and designing a programme and an offer around solely that. So it's best targeted. Historically, the culture and the leisure sectors are much more better at that sort of engagement. The parks providers less so, and I think there's a task to bring that whole approach up to speed, really.
And do you think there's a benefit in terms of, for example, I know it's a bit controversial, the whole sort of forest school and taking whole lessons outside, but actually taking children into the parks? Because it seems to me that one of the issues about improving access to parks is to get children from all backgrounds, and there's no school that isn't very mixed in London in terms of ethnicity, and everybody comes from a different background, and getting them into the parks in the first place, because I sometimes think there are some barriers with children from and all social groups as well, because their parents don't take them to the park or to the common or to whatever. And when they do, it's an unfamiliar environment because, you know, it might look a bit messy. There might be some biodiversity that they're not used to. There might be something prickly. You know, there might be something that they're not allowed to eat. Do you think there's a benefit to having that engagement with teachers and schools?
Definitely, and from early years.
From very early years.
Very early on.
Yes.
That's why I'm here today.
Yeah.
As a young kid.
Particular consideration given to those schools for children with special educational needs, autism, where you know the benefits of an outdoors environment, you know, are absolute when it comes to dealing with those sorts of difficulties.
But in terms of playgrounds, you have to manage them. They have to be safe, in good condition, attractive places. This requires serious money. And a lot of councils are really struggling now to maintain their basic playgrounds.
I guess
so this is the first age group.
I'm thinking more about nature,
Yeah.
because the problem with playgrounds is everyone is very aware of the safety things, and so they're now all covered in surfaces that are, you know, not natural because they're made out. They call it springy turf, but we all know it's, you know, it's like the plastic grass I referred to earlier. So what are still the barriers that people experience to making use of green space? And how can they be overcome? This is my sort of final question, and then Caroline's got one right at the end. Do you think there are...
Well, it goes back to the refugee project that I was helping to deliver. I think a lot of people just don't realise it's there for them and that they can use it. But I mean, this is a hypothesis, and one of the things I've sort of been aware of while we've been talking about it, and with your question, David, and yours, is that actually there isn't enough survey work, I think, of actually what people of London want from their local parks, the usage, and then the satisfaction levels. I think actually that's been lost in the local authority cuts, is that we don't actually know the satisfaction levels for our parks and why people aren't going to them. So it's quite a tricky question to unpick. We have some ideas from historic evidence, but it's not a regular thing that's going on.
In terms of the survey, and just to compliment Ian, who I think was one of the leading lights, Ian Williamson, who's sitting here very, very quietly, but helped us with the first investigation that we did. And we did put something out, and we got something like 3,500 responses from people saying what they felt about parks and open spaces. This is when we did the Park Life report. Someone obviously likes song titles in City Hall. And one of the things that came out very strongly from that report was what people really appreciated was something that was virtually on their doorstep. They really wanted something local, which also sort of comes back to my question before about, you know, tiny parks, and is it almost better to have lots? I mean, the group I was with last night, it's in Southfield's Grid, and they've set up a sort of splinter organisation which has been called Greening the Grid, and they have been systematically, with some money possibly from City Hall but definitely from the council, planting flowers around the base of every single tree. And they've also been running winter wonderland and getting people to go past and look at each other's windows. And they also run a sort of hanging baskets and front gardens competition. So the whole area has gone from being, you know, where people were doing all the sort of typical paving over the front gardens, and it is now becoming much more of that healthy streets environment and the biodiversity gain. And they're not far from 2 or 3 actual open spaces, but the linkages now in terms of the biodiversity that's there, I think, are amazing.
A very quick point about that. I think there is an issue about, so Natural England do regular surveys of people's use of the natural environment. And one of the things they've picked up on is that one of the barriers to using parks is not the fact the park's no good or it's not close enough. It's people's times. People's lives are much busier, much more diverse than they ever used to be. So part of the sort of philosophy now is, and it goes back to your point about links, is how you build access to the park or access to the green space into your daily activity, rather than it being something you do on a Sunday afternoon. It's something you do on your way to work. So the walking, cycling routes to the tube station go through the park. So you have that more regular contact with the park and the green space, which links into TfL's ambition to get 80% of Londoners actively doing 30 minutes of activity each day, and you build it into people's daily lives rather than it being something seen as separate. And it goes to Sean's point about parks having a fence, and it's being as a separate space. They need to be part and parcel of your daily life.
So the answer is the best way is just to make being in nature, being in the park, the open space, the heath, the common, whatever it is part of your overall activity for that day, every day.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
That answers my question.
Okay, well, everyone, we've an amazing morning of it's been incredibly interesting, and you know, the idea of creeping memorialisation is not something that I thought of, but actually really resonated, and also I think the importance of the staff in parks and the cuts to those staff having an impact on things like youth engagement, and what you know, some of those benefits from parks which are potentially at risk of being lost or have been lost, but could be regained by all these hints about an interesting strategic approach that is about to be released within this next week, which I'll definitely keep my ears open for. And I think the other thing is the importance of actually listening to communities and engaging with communities. And Ian just gave me a sort of an example, which is that the local friends group in Blythe Hill Fields near Catford intervened on the spot last week to stop a contractor from mistakenly mowing over the biodiverse grass patch. When you've got local residents who have absolute ownership and engagement with a green space, then they will leap in to defend that green space. Just because they happen to be there, their daily life is taking them through the park, and they're there to catch the mistake before it happens. So just before we wind up, I just want to give each of you the chance to say if there's one thing that you think the Mayor could do that would best support action by people and communities to make more use of their green spaces. If there's one thing you'd like to tell the Mayor to do, I don't know, Peter, is that a slightly odd question for you? But for the four of you who are in
You
front,
can't ask him because he tells the Mayor what to do.
Yeah, no, exactly. So just listen hard, Peter. Chris, do you want to start?
I think it's just the messaging around our green spaces as a really crucial, solution to much bigger global problems around climate change, environmental degradation, and the importance of maintaining, a flourishing biodiversity in an urban setting. So that natural world, the bigger issues around the global, situation, and what role our London parks play in being proper mitigation against that.
Dave, have you got one thing?
Yes, well, I think that the adoption of London as a national park city is a huge step for the profile of parks and green spaces, but it needs to be, as Helen said earlier, given teeth. And I'd like to know what percentage of Transport for London's budget is going into maintaining these important green routes, paths, and green routes through parks that we're encouraging people to use, but park services can't afford to mend. So I'd like to know, that's something you can ask as the committee.
Oh, we will.
What's the percentage of that budget, and also how much planning gain money is being put into parks? All this housing that's being built, people need parks and green spaces. I'd like to see, is it 30%, is it 50% of that money, or is it like 0%? And I think that's something the committee can have an influence on.
Okay, thank you. And Tony?
I think there's perhaps a greater role for the Mayor to involve Team London in working with communities around parks and green spaces, in mobilising volunteers, not just like being a parachute group coming down and doing something, which I don't think is sustainable, but by connecting local businesses with local parks to build up a long-term relationship, not corporate branding and all that, but more where the people working for that business get involved with that space or those spaces on a long-term basis, almost adopt it. And that they don't just get involved in terms of painting the railings, dare I say, or something like that, but they provide perhaps support to the Friends group where they might need legal advice or financial advice, things like that very practical things that multiplied across London could be very impactful.
So kind of bringing more skills into the network of support for
Absolutely.
parks.
And bringing together business and
Yeah.
parks.
Yeah.
I mean, many of our, particularly central London parks, are used by office workers. They're not paying their rates to that local
Westminster.
council or even to London.
Yeah.
You know, they're
They're
commuting.
It was one of
Yeah.
our recommendations
Yes.
from last time, so we
Okay.
need
Yeah.
to check out.
Pick up
the
on
list.
that. And Helen,
Well, I think I'd like to see a greater investment in upgrading of horticultural skills and the recognition of paying proper wages to horticultural people involved in working in parks and giving them a higher status. I think also I'd like the Mayor for London to sign up to the Charter for Parks. I'm surprised you didn't ask for that, Dave. And
I was hoping someone else would.
for all green spaces to be declared fields in trust so that they can't be encroached on. I'd like more seriousness taken to rights to light in outdoor spaces, not just indoor. And obviously, I'd like you all to buy a ticket to Open Gun Squares weekend.
fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for what has been an incredibly helpful morning. Can I now ask the committee to note the report and the subsequent discussion, and to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to agree the work programme for the beginning of the 2019-20 Assembly year as set out in paragraphs 4.2 to 4.4?
Agreed.
And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 27th of June at 10 a.m. in Committee Room 5 at City Hall. And finally, I do for once have a piece of any other business. This is Ian Williamson's last meeting as Scrutiny Manager. He's been Scrutiny Manager for the Environment Committee for the last 10 years. He's been here at City Hall for 13 years. Ian, I really want to thank you. I mean, just the support you give to the chair, and I'm sure Leonie would back this up. It is amazing having someone like Ian sitting next to you while you're chairing this meeting, just sending useful notes or giving a little, yes, we've already picked that one up. Incredibly helpful. But you have made the work of our committee useful, relevant and incisive. And I know I speak on behalf of all members and all our support staff when I say thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you, and we wish you well in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually,
Oh.
I'd just like to associate myself with Caroline's remarks. I did say something earlier on in our pre-meeting, but Ian was a great support to me for the 2 years when I was the chair, and has provided another year of good support to Caroline. And I think the fact that he's supported the committee as a whole for a long period of time was really helpful, because many of us on this committee, 4 of us in this room now, were new in 2016, so he helped us scrub up quickly and turn into assembly members.
Okay, I'm now going to bang the gavel. And that means the meeting's over. Sorry to...
GLA Committee